In 2006, the United States Navy deliberately sank one of its own aircraft carriers. Not during a war, not in combat, and not because it had been damaged by an enemy. The ship was USS Oriskany, a World War II-era aircraft carrier that had served the United States for decades. It survived the end of World War II. It served through the early Cold War. And when its active service finally ended, it was still structurally intact. Yet instead of being dismantled or sold, the Navy made a calculated decision to sink it. This video explains why. This is not a story about a ship that became dangerous with time. It is not about a hidden threat or an unresolved mystery. It is about a post-war problem the Navy could not ignore, involving cost, safety, and responsibility, and the practical decisions that followed when scrapping a World War II aircraft carrier proved far more complicated than it appeared. To understand why sinking became the chosen solution, we first need to understand what kind of ship Oriskany was, and what the Navy was actually left with when its service life finally came to an end. The decision to sink Oriskany did not begin with disposal plans. By the time its service life ended, the Navy was no longer dealing with a ship. It was dealing with a problem that had no simple solution. USS Oriskany was laid down in 1944 during the final year of World War II as part of the Essex class, a design created for a specific kind of war at a specific moment in time. By the time Oriskany was completed and commissioned in 1950, that war was already over. This mattered. Oriskany had been designed around the assumptions of World War II naval aviation: propeller-driven aircraft, shorter takeoff distances, and a slower operational tempo. But the carrier entered service in a Navy that was already transitioning into the jet age. Physically, it was enormous, over 880 feet long, displacing tens of thousands of tons. Oriskany was not a vessel that could be easily moved, dismantled, or repurposed once its usefulness ended. And unlike many wartime ships, Oriskany did not disappear quickly. It served for more than 2 decades, operating through the 1950s and 1960s as naval aviation evolved rapidly around it. To remain viable, the ship underwent major modifications, changes to its flight deck, internal systems, and structural layout. Those upgrades extended its service life, but they also changed the nature of the ship itself. Inside, Oriskany became a layered structure. Systems installed under different standards, materials added decades apart, compartments rebuilt again and again to meet new requirements. When Oriskany was finally decommissioned in the mid-1970s, it was no longer just a retired warship. It was a large, heavily modified aircraft carrier from another era, one whose size, age, and internal complexity would shape every decision the Navy faced next. And that complexity explains why Oriskany could not be treated like an ordinary surplus vessel. By the time USS Oriskany entered service, the Navy was already facing a problem that would not appear all at once, but would grow steadily over time. Oriskany did not fail early. It did not disappear after a single conflict. Instead, it remained in service as naval aviation changed faster than the ship itself could. During the 1950s and 1960s, aircraft became heavier, faster, and more demanding. Each change forced the Navy to adapt its carriers, and Oriskany was repeatedly modified to keep pace. Flight deck systems were altered. Internal layouts were reworked. New equipment was installed to meet evolving operational and safety standards. These changes extended Oriskany's usefulness, but they also introduced a pattern that would define the ship's later years. Every upgrade added weight. Every new system increased complexity. And every decade layered new requirements onto a structure that had been designed for a very different era. As newer aircraft carriers entered service, Oriskany's role gradually narrowed. It was no longer a frontline asset. It became a ship that required increasing resources to deliver diminishing returns. By the early 1970s, maintaining Oriskany demanded significant funding, manpower, and time. while newer carriers provided greater capability with fewer compromises. When Oriskany was removed from active service in the mid-1970s, it was not because something had gone wrong. It was because time had done its work. What the Navy was left with was not a damaged vessel, but an aging one, still massive, still intact, and still carrying the accumulated consequences of decades of operation and modification. By that point, the question was no longer how to operate Oriskany. It was what to do with what it had become. When USS Oriskany left active service, the Navy was not simply dealing with an empty hull. What remained on board was the cumulative result of decades of design choices, modifications, and materials that had been standard at the time they were installed. Much of it was not removable without dismantling the ship itself. Throughout Oriskany's structure were large quantities of asbestos-based materials. They had been used extensively for insulation, fireproofing, and thermal protection, not because of negligence, but because they were considered effective and safe when the ship was built and modernized. By the time Oriskany was retired, those materials were no longer acceptable by modern standards. They could not be left unattended. They could not be removed casually, and they could not be isolated without extensive containment procedures. In addition to insulation and construction materials, residues from decades of operation remained inside the ship's systems. Fuel lines, storage tanks, machinery spaces, and internal compartments all carried traces of substances that had accumulated slowly over time. None of these disappeared when the ship stopped sailing. Removing them required controlled dismantling, specialized facilities, and strict oversight. Every step introduced cost, risk, and long-term responsibility. Unlike smaller vessels, Oriskany's size amplified the problem. An aircraft carrier is not dismantled in sections without consequence. Its internal layout is dense, interconnected, and layered, the result of multiple generations of engineering standards coexisting within the same hull. Attempting to remove everything that remained on board meant exposing workers to hazardous materials, committing shipyards to long-term projects, and assuming responsibility for waste that could not simply be discarded. Leaving the ship intact was not a neutral option either. As long as Oriskany existed in reserve, the Navy remained responsible for monitoring its condition, preventing deterioration, and managing the risks associated with what remained inside. There was no moment when the obligation ended on its own. By the early 2000s, the Navy was no longer deciding whether Oriskany had value as a ship. It was deciding how to manage the consequences of keeping it or taking it apart over decades to come. That reality narrowed the available options. At first glance, the solution seemed straightforward. When a ship is no longer needed, it is dismantled. The steel is cut apart, the systems are removed, and the hull is recycled. On paper, scrapping appeared to be the obvious answer. In practice, USS Oriskany was not an ordinary candidate for dismantling. Scrapping an aircraft carrier is not a single operation. It is a long sequence of controlled processes that must be carried out in specialized facilities under strict environmental and safety regulations. For Oriskany, the scale of the task magnified every challenge. Its size meant that dismantling would take years, not months. Its internal complexity meant that materials could not be removed in isolation. Every cut exposed additional systems, additional materials, and additional responsibility. Workers would have to operate inside confined spaces that contained substances no longer acceptable under modern standards. Each phase of dismantling would require containment, monitoring, and disposal, all under regulatory oversight. This translated directly into cost, not just the cost of labor and facilities, but the cost of long-term liability. Once dismantling began, the Navy would assume responsibility for every material removed, transported, stored, or disposed of. There was no clear endpoint where that responsibility ended. By comparison, keeping the ship in reserve was also not a solution. It delayed decisions without eliminating obligations, while maintenance and monitoring continued indefinitely. From an administrative perspective, the Navy was faced with a narrow set of options, none of which were simple, none of which were inexpensive, and none of which allowed responsibility to simply be transferred away. Scrapping was possible, but for Oriskany, it was not the straightforward or final solution it appeared to be. By the early 2000s, the range of realistic options had narrowed. Keeping USS Oriskany in reserve meant accepting indefinite responsibility for a ship that no longer served an operational purpose. Scrapping it meant committing to a long, expensive process with no clear endpoint. The Navy began to consider a different approach. Instead of dismantling the carrier, it would be prepared, cleaned to specific standards, and deliberately sunk in a controlled location. This was not a disposal shortcut. It was a regulated process governed by environmental, safety, and legal requirements. Before sinking, the ship underwent extensive preparation. Materials identified as unacceptable for ocean placement were removed. Systems were cleaned. Compartments were inspected and documented. The objective was not to erase the ship, but to reduce long-term responsibility to a manageable, defined outcome. Sinking Oriskany would place the remaining structure beyond routine human access, while allowing the Navy to meet regulatory obligations in a single, finite operation, rather than managing the ship indefinitely. There was also a secondary consideration. Once on the seafloor, the carrier could serve as an artificial reef. Over time, it would become a stable structure supporting marine life, rather than a deteriorating vessel requiring constant oversight. In 2006, after years of evaluation and preparation, the decision was executed. Oriskany was sunk deliberately, under controlled conditions, at a designated site in the Gulf of Mexico. The ship disappeared from the surface, but the responsibility for it did not simply vanish. The difference was that the responsibility had finally been resolved into a form the Navy could manage. USS Oriskany was built for a war that ended before it entered service. It went on to serve for decades, adapting again and again as technology and strategy changed around it. When that service finally ended, the ship did not simply fade away. It became a problem of scale, complexity, and responsibility, one that did not resolve itself with time. The Navy examined its options. Keeping the ship meant indefinite oversight. Scrapping it meant a long process with no clear endpoint. Neither offered a clean conclusion. Sinking Oriskany was not an act of destruction, and it was not a symbolic gesture. It was an administrative decision, a way to turn an open-ended obligation into a defined outcome. The ship disappeared from the surface in 2006, but the decision behind that moment had been forming for years. USS Oriskany shows how some of the most powerful tools of World War II remained difficult to manage long after the war itself had ended, and how in peacetime, the challenge was no longer how to use them, but how to take responsibility for what they had become.